The locomotive. The locomotive. Come on, baby. Do the locomotion with me, right? The powerful, evocative metaphor from Anna Karenina, or Anna Karenina, if you are just determined to sound country and ignorant at fashionable garden parties while rubbing shoulders with the jet set in high society in your generic boat shoes. And maybe ascot mask. Especially in film, there is nothing more powerful than the locomotive. Cramped quarters, especially if you are of sufficient means and leisure to travel by sleeper car, and actually have a Pullman porter as your manservant while steaming along the rails in a cross-country excursion, feeling just a little bit claustrophobic. Pressing yourself up against a wall to attempt to maneuver around someone, probably some idiot with a coach seat pretending to be lost on his way to the diner call so he could rub shoulders with the high society types. Buddy, your snack car is the other way, right? No such thing as a classless society on a cross-country locomotive track, unless you were stuck in coach. But whether you are in coach or in the sleeper or spending some time in the observer car, all aboard are stuck inside, and the locomotive is stuck on that track with no plans to go off-roading, mudding, and explore. So at least in that sense, everyone can say they are equal and will arrive at the same destination at the same time, barring some unplanned contingency arising in your itinerary that finds you aboard the Silver Streak, barreling into the station in Chicago, or finds you like the guy aboard Pelham 123 saying to himself that somewhere there has to be a stop signal to alter the fate of a runaway locomotive. And in this final locomotive installment, rather than focusing on the stop signals that are planned, being proactive in the highly unlikely event that the dead man's brake should fail after the motorman becomes incapacitated or disabled, we're going to shift focus away from the risk that you assume. Remember that assumption of risk, legal term of art that we learned from the law, by boarding that means of conveyance to get you to your destination and depart from the silver screen to return to a literary tradition about locomotives. And with a locomotive with which everyone has at least some level of familiarity if you went through grammar school, the faster than a speeding bullet, nothing more powerful than a locomotive that we find in the children's literary classic, like in The Legend of John Henry, the locomotive man, so strong that he could even beat a steam-powered drill, engine number 50, even if it would undo himself trying to outdo the machine, working so hard that it bursted his heart. But whose legend even inspired the Baldwin Locomotive Works to construct a steam engine that even ran on the Norfolk and Western Railroad line, number 2300, albeit plagued with many, many difficulties in there to take it off the track. And of course, that fabled child story about the little engine who could. Just a pumping away with confidence saying, I think I can, I think I can, I know I can, I know I can, until his triumph song steaming up that mountain became the little locomotive who knew he could. And again, we find a little intersection with law, going to the manufacturer, products liability, or what attorneys in contract law might describe as the implied warranties. Creatures of what attorneys call common law, or those unwritten legal principles, jurisprudence, that go all the way back to the days of Mary Old England, and which include an implied warranty of fitness for purpose, or that locomotive has been guaranteed by the manufacturer to do exactly what a locomotive should do. Taste good like a cigarette should. The implied warranty of merchantability, or the manufacturer's guarantee that that locomotive is going to reasonably conform to ordinary expectations. You're not going to get high smoking a Marlboro cigarette. unless it was sold as is, then all bets are off. There were no expectations. And the implied warranty of title, or that the person who sold you that locomotive was not attempting to sell you something that he actually stole from somebody else. And let's continue this examination as applied to a locomotive novel coronavirus. Locomotive fitness for purpose. Locomotive has been guaranteed by the manufacturer to do exactly what a locomotive should, right? The latest zoonotic evolution report of the World Health Organization now claims that the first onsets of infection from COVID-19 probably arose in China around December 1st, 2020, with the first presumptive cases around December 4th actually coming to a clinic or a hospital. But on December 31st, 2020, the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission reported a cluster of cases, of a pneumonia of unknown etiology. Didn't know what it was yet, but which appeared so similar to cases that had arisen in Hong Kong in 2003 that they had already begun to use that SARS model as a template to identify these new cases, distinguishing them from other respiratory tract infections that were coming in the door that arose in Wuhan, 27 of which, not a very large number, were connected to the Hunan wholesale seafood market, a venue measuring the size of 9 football fields. Pretty large, 27 cases, 9 football fields, 3 per football field. Some have estimated that Wuhan has almost 12 million people, which is a lot of people. And by January 4th, WHO was already on social media telling the entire world, even though there had been no reported fatalities yet, January 4th. And by January 14th, the total cases totaled only 41 in a city with a population larger than the 8.4 million people in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So let's assume that these strange pneumonia cases that look enough like SARS that doctors are already using the template to identify patients and isolate cases of this brand new disease is a brand new disease or emerging pathogen, to sound like an epidemiologist. Put on your little stethoscope, lab coat. We still have less than 50 cases, most in a very large wet market and in a city with a population larger than the Commonwealth of Virginia. And now let's do a little role play and assume that you are now the Wuhan Health Commissioner. Would you, as a reasonable person concerned about your career and how others think about you, have sounded off the alarm to World Health authorities at that point? And now try to get into character and assume another identity. You are the director of the World Health Organization and you received that report from this person. Less than 50 cases of a potentially new disease in a city with a population larger than that of Virginia. Do you get up on social media and panic the world? But by January 12th, the Chinese have already examined this new pathogen under an electron microscope and began sharing the genome sequence to warn everyone in the world about a novel coronavirus. Novel coronavirus. And people were calling it the novel coronavirus. That by the next day had found only one other case in Thailand. But still, by that point, nobody had yet died. You know, just pneumonia. People get pneumonia all the time. By January 22nd, nobody is even positively certain that this new disease is being transmitted from person to person. And the first death would not occur until January 14th, around the same time that the first case of infection in the United States had returned from Wuhan to Seattle Airport. A patient who came into contact with 68 people in 4 days running around the Puget Sound, had gone on a 20-hour flight from Wuhan to Seattle, a 25-mile share ride, infected nobody. And even scientists in China could neither confirm nor deny at that point that there was definite evidence that COVID-19 was being transmitted from person to person. Locomotive novel coronavirus and fitness for purpose question. Does this pathogen, based on the evidence to a reasonable person, at this point on the timeline present evidence of the bandwidth to create an international news story? Back in the days when I worked in strategic counterintelligence, the running joke and guide precaution to save your career was, do you really want to risk your career and wake the president, or can you handle this? By the science and common sense, this is not the picture of the locomotive who could. To be sure, by January 30th, when the World Health Organization is issuing the 6th declaration of a public health emergency of international concern in history, or PHEIC, all of which have been viruses. And viruses tend to be the least likely pathogen to become an emerging public health threat because they are the most abundant in the world. And before COVID-19 had produced only 220 harmful to man. But there are over 7,800 cases, with only 82 in 18 countries outside China. And maybe at that point, there may be a little more heightened concern, but there are still only a total of 170 deaths, all in China, with a population of over 1 billion, and nobody had yet died outside of China. And even at this point, the Chinese and the World Health Organization, looking at almost 8,000 cases, having isolated the pathogen, identified the genome sequencing, and treating cases for over a month, have no idea whether or not COVID-19 is a communicable disease being transmitted from person to person. Are they looking at the secondary infections? Locomotive, novel coronavirus, your career and your reputation is on the line as a doctor. Think about your mama. Would you wake the president? Executive decisions, command decisions is the term we use in the Army. You want to be able to make command decisions. Get that assume command immediately, promote immediately, bullet on your OER. Think about what your rater and senior rater are going to write on your performance evaluation if you are totally wrong. Locomotive, novel coronavirus, and fitness for purpose. By the science and common sense, this is not the picture of the locomotive who could. By February 24th, there were over 55,000 cases in China. They had dispatched 1,800 teams of at least 5 epidemiologists to perform the priority day one task of following up on tracer contacts. And what did they find regarding the level of infectiousness? Highly contagious disease, super spreader events? Well, according to the report, they found that these infected folks were failing to infect over 95% of the people with whom they were coming into close contact. Contagious? That is 4 times too low to an epidemiologist to validate the existence of a communicable disease being transmitted from person to person. But what was China doing in Wuhan? And mostly only in Wuhan and some surrounding areas? Locking down, issuing stay-at-home orders, telling everyone to wear facial coverings. Remember, they're not certain that it's a communicable disease, but they're doing this. Canceling travel, closing ports. Does that seem a little out of proportion to a few hundred dead people in a country with over 1 billion people? Over 11 million just in Wuhan? And looking at the clinical data, be a scientist, from these cases, what did the World Health Organization tell the world? 1, do not lock down. 2, perform tracer contacts follow-ups. 3, this crisis can be resolved without any pharmacological intervention, which is a doctor's way of saying there is no need to develop any vaccines, especially since over 80% of the infection cases appear to require absolutely no medical treatment at all. 4, the infections appear to be highly correlated to specific locations. There's something going on with the locations. 5, the disease appeared to be mostly affecting farming families in the largest city in the central mainland of China. Kind of odd. 6, in plain and clear English, COVID-19 is not an infectious disease. And 7, if there is anything that is a high top priority, the elderly are the highest fatality risk and must be protected. They said that 3 times, so they probably considered that pretty important. By the science and common sense, this is not the picture of the locomotive who could create a pandemic. And in Virginia, what did the nation's only physician serving as a state governor do? Well, he had his state health commissioner declare a communicable disease a public health threat 1 month too early, blew off tracer contacts, failed to protect the elderly, locked down the entire state, killed the economy, and told everyone that COVID-19 is a highly contagious disease. 5% infectious, by definition, is not an infectious disease. The World Health Organization just told them in plain English, it's not an infectious disease. But old people dying were isolated from their families, going to their graves with a disease that they could not give their families if they tried. Locomotive novel coronavirus and fitness for purpose. If you were the governor, put on your governor hat now, what would you have done with that clinical science information, especially if you had medical training? By the science and common sense, this is not the picture of the locomotive who could. Implied warranty of merchantability, or the manufacturer's guarantees that the locomotive is going to reasonably conform to ordinary expectations. This little and invisible locomotive is far exceeding ordinary expectations for an infectious disease by the science and common sense. The implied warranty of title, or that the person who sold you that locomotive, novel coronavirus, was not attempting to sell you something that he actually stole from somebody else. And so this was the question that was posed in a FOIA request to the president about a month ago, and for which there should be some reply by April 20th. Is the secondary attack rate an infectious dose, or the amount of this pathogen that is required to actually cause you to become infected, classified information? Because based upon those validated less than 5% infectiousness levels of COVID-19 that we're finding consistently in the studies, in the science, it should not have ever have become a pandemic pathogen that has been attributed to the deaths of over 500,000 Americans and over 10,500 in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And over half of those, the elderly in nursing homes, who were known high fatality risk from the very beginning. Going to die alone with disease that they cannot give anybody else. And there is no reason why, if scientists have performed Koch's postulates, just like epidemiologists have been doing since the 1870s, to validate causation and to determine the infectious dose, no doctor, scientist, clinician, or vaccine manufacturer can quantify the infectious dose required to cause a COVID-19 infection. Don't you need that to determine whether or not a vaccine is going to be efficacious at preventing disease? And this is actually a trick question that perhaps only a former operations officer for strategic counterintelligence could ask. Because the president, under Executive Order 12958, signed by President Bill Clinton on April 17, 1995, when I was in that capacity, the president can only classify the information of that type if the United States actually owns COVID-19. I believe it's one of the most ghostly manifestations that I have ever seen. Whether it is real or simply conjecture, one of those things that people seeking to find some mystery to fool themselves into believing, but with some other perfectly rational cause, is a question that only you can answer with your capacity for reason. Impossible. So was Xeroxing and holography just a few years ago. In fact, so were videotape replays like the one you're watching right now. People have been claiming an existence of God for thousands of years, and maybe one day we will finally know the answers as to how and why and what. What a tremendous gain that would be for science. But what a tragic loss for storytelling. No one knows the day nor the hour when all mysteries shall be revealed. But we'll be watching and we'll be waiting in earnest, incessant, and fervent prayer for the advancement of the kingdom of God. Be sure to join us next time as events evolve with science and faith in a pandemic election that some have claimed is the presidential election of their lifetime. My name is Major Mike Webb with liberty, honor, and excellence by God. We shall make America great again. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.